Welcome to Byju's classes. We are back again with yet another edition of our weekly review of international relations, where we try to chronicle all the events, major and some minor, all across the globe, which have a significant bearing on our national interest and which are likely to impact on international relations in months to come. We begin with North American continent, where President Trump, true to his form, remained pugnacious. He celebrated on 4th July the American Day of Independence, and he did it in style, if some may say with bad taste. He went to Mount Rushmore, where there had been a great opposition to his arrival there. The original Indian Americans, their descendants, were objecting to his coming there and using the backdrop of this mountain, which has the statues, the faces of some American presidents carved, some of them at the moment a bit controversial due to the race rage. Trump has decided, it seems, to launch his campaign by dividing America along race lines. So he came out with a statement that all this leftist protest movement, he blames everything on the leftists. Actually, he went further this time. He said ultra-left cultural revolution is going to shake the foundations of the American nation. It is going to undo the American Revolution, it is going to subvert the American Constitution, and it will not happen on his watch. So what he's trying to do is to divide the nation even deeper. The nation has been divided by the coronavirus between the rich and the poor, the men of color, women of color, and the white supremacists, about the religious evangelists and more liberal humanist people. But the problem is that he, I think, is going for broke. He knows his ratings are falling. Biden is ahead of him in double-digit lead for 4 or 5 weeks now running. So he has decided to do this. Now, he also held a jam-packed meeting in a hall nestling under the Mount Rushmore, which accommodated not more than 7,000 to 8,000 people. But for America, there's a big crowd. And what is even more disturbing is that nobody in this pro-Trump rally observed, with very few exceptions, either the warnings about masks or about physical, what we call in this country, social distancing. Ivanka Trump did message on Twitter to her supporters, and she's an advisor of the president, his daughter, that please take all the precautions, use masks, keep social distancing. But nobody here did that. And Trump was in his element. He was rosy-cheeked, his power tie, red-colored tie, and he was glowing. And he was trying to say that, look, I have sworn to protect the Constitution and I will stand by the Second Amendment. And the Second Amendment, as everybody knows, is the right to bear arms. And the right to bear arms is directly related to the white supremacists who say that they wouldn't like to live in a communist country, they wouldn't like to live in a country which is overtaken by men of color, whom they think that they are not their equals, but they are inferiors. At the same time, President Trump also said that he doesn't like the idea of the heroes of American history being denigrated, their statues being defaced and so on. And he said if he has his way, he did not go into details, he will have a national park where he would install these heroes even with greater pomp. But the fact remains that once there is this so much anguish about violence meted out to descendants of people whose ancestors had been enslaved, I think the tide is not going to be stemmed very easily. And people remember that while Trump is saying all these things, he is trying to distract attention from his utter abject failure of controlling the coronavirus or coming out with a sane scientific response to it. He has been flouting the advice of medical experts, and even the way he arrived at Mount Rushmore was very funny. Presidential plane Air Force One took certain celebratory rounds of the mountain, then he got on to Marine One helicopter. Part of the reason was to avoid the protesters of Black Lives Matter who were trying to disrupt his meeting, this evening's meeting. So the meeting may have been successful from Trump's point of view. I think the Republicans are very worried, but this might trigger off another round of a surge of coronavirus, and people would say that who's this president who is so bent upon risking the lives of the Americans. But the Americans, as we have noticed before, are divided along these lines. Some want to re-establish white supremacy. Some want to go back to their heroes of the American Civil War, even if they fought against what are the enshrined values of the Constitution. And Trump seems to be using the rhetoric, the demagoguery to stay in power. Another problem in the American continent is that where in the southern American continent, where Brazil is there, where Argentina is there, where Venezuela is there, in the Central America where Mexico is there, all oil producing countries are in deep trouble because of the coronavirus, like in the North American continent where the people affected have crossed the number of 1 million, have reached 1,600,000. And when we come down to Brazil, it is also touching a 1 million contagion figure. Those dead are mounting up to 60,000. Whether it is Chile, whether it is Mexico, whether it is Bolivia, whether it is Peru, whether it is Argentina, everybody is reeling. So when their economies are going to be in a tailspin, how is it going to impact on America, the North American continent, is something which we have to bear in mind. And Trump insists on subverting the Venezuelan government. The stage-managed coup has failed. Now he has come out with this, that if the Venezuelans want to trade in oil with Iran or China, he would interfere with the tankers plying this trade with them. So he has threatened the owners of oil tankers with dire consequences, their captains with destroying their careers. But what they do, that these things are not unknown in international politics. The tankers indulging in contraband trade either change the flags of convenience, change their names, they change ownership, and all these threats become almost in the end empty threats, and this leads to a person like Maduro, who again is fighting with his back to the wall in Venezuela, who knows that he is sitting over the largest known reserves of petroleum in the world. He can't bear the sight of his countrymen queuing up for long lines to get gasoline and not having enough money in hard currency to import food grains to feed them or medicines to treat them. So I think there has been a total failure of the so-called reimposition of Monroe Doctrine by Trump in Latin America. And if we come to the northernmost tip of America, in Canada, we have had two interesting bits of news over the past week. One is on the lighter note, that somebody rammed in the gates and entered the official residence of Justin Trudeau, the young Canadian Prime Minister, and stayed on the grounds for about 13 minutes before he could be apprehended and arrested. Interestingly, Trudeau also announced that he was going to complete, he got a favorable judgment from the Supreme Court in Canada, that to build a hundreds of kilometers long pipeline which would carry gas from Canadian sources, gas fields, to the Pacific British Columbian site where the ports would be there. But he also tried to persuade his countrymen that although in past he had, when in opposition, opposed this, now it is required in the coronavirus struck economy of Canada to rebuild the economy fast. This is the one of the major resources which Canada has to rebuild. And he also tried to remind his audiences and electorate this was necessary because almost 99% of the Canadian gas and oil goes down to America at a concessional price agreed upon between the two countries. But what remains to be seen is what customers is Trudeau eyeing on the Pacific coast. Japan, South Korea, but obviously the Russia adjacent to Alaska doesn't need this resource. It has ample of its own, and ultimately the most attractive buyer is China. But how long can they resist not trading with China? And once he changes the direction of this trade, are the Americans going to like it? So all likelihood, tensions will rise between Trump's America and Trudeau's Canada in coming days. President Putin in Russia completed some long pending work last week. He had proposed constitutional amendments that would allow him to continue in power for the next 2 terms after the present term is over, which meant that he would almost be the president of Russia for lifetime. He's 67 now, and by the time his 2 extended terms end, he would be close to 80. But the coronavirus had interfered with the public approval of these constitutional amendments. Now, we have been discussing this before, that he didn't have to have a stamp of public approval. It had been passed, the proposed amendments had been passed by both houses of parliament and the constitutional court. He had signed it to become a decree, but he wanted to show the world that he was an extremely popular leader, and the people of Russia wanted him to lead the nation through this critical period of instability, coronavirus, post-corona economic recovery, and so on and so forth. There are three interesting things about this constitutional amendment when it was finally passed. It says that one of the core beliefs of the Russia is belief in God. So it becomes if not a theocratic state, a state where a person can be probably persecuted for almost on the grounds of blasphemy, saying that he doesn't believe in a core value of the Russian state or the Russian nation. That's number one. Number two, he said that LGBTQ people have no role in Russia, which believes in family values and traditional family values and so on. So which seems to be going against the regime of human rights elsewhere in the world. And the third one, I think, is the most interesting one from the point of view of students of international relations. He said that the Russian law would have primacy over international custom and practices of international law. Now this is interesting because this seems to be a common feature among all the three major actors in international relations today. The Americans claim immunity for their soldiers against war crimes, crimes against humanity. The Chinese selectively either appeal to the canons of international law when it suits them, or they say they have had nothing to do with this international law. They go back on treaties, they go back on commitments, like in the case of Hong Kong, which we shall discuss separately. But the Russians saying the same means that the three major actors in international relations are not going to support the existing structure of international law or customary practices. Now, interestingly, this is the statement of fact, because Putin has not always cared for the norms of diplomatic practices or international law, whether it is getting his opponents assassinated elsewhere in other countries, targeting them, or making unilateral military interventions in erstwhile republics of Soviet Union like Georgia, Ukraine, etc., or annexation of Crimea. Putin also seems to have conveyed, after this pending work is over, that he is at the moment, for the time being, quite willing to accept a slightly shrunken role for Russia in international relations. He is not going to indulge in overreach from Eurasian Pacific Rim to Europe and beyond. He seems to be concentrating on making his presence felt in the Middle East, controlling the strategic locations and situations there, whether it is Syria. And he also announced last week that he's appointing a Russian ambassador to Libya, who at the moment will be posted in Tunisia, but would be in charge of all of Libya. And Russia is one of those countries with Egypt who is, backing the Haftar renegade generals, the insurgents forces. So this is going to be interesting how this is going to play out in future. We have talked in past about Putin supporting mercenaries elsewhere in Africa also. So he is doing it very cleverly without either overcommitting Russian financial resources or committing overtly Russian military forces on ground. But at the same time, last time we did discuss that how there were rumors of the Russians having offered bounty to Taliban to kill Americans in Afghanistan. So it is the question of using the asymmetry of financial resources and military forces on ground, which he seems to be taking an advantage of. He seems to be more interested in erstwhile members of Soviet Empire, which have now joined the European Union, like Poland and Hungary. So I think we are going to see more of this, the Russians looking more towards Eastern Europe, Russians having a more, shall we say, resilient line against the Chinese, because whatever might be there, the Chinese are the most attractive buyers of their gas in Siberia. And also China shares a border with Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkestan, Kyrgyzstan, where the Russians would like to be reassured that nothing which China does there impinges on their national interest. So this is the state of the affair in Putin's Russia at the moment. Putin can be satisfied with the completion of long pending work, and the rest of the world will have to cope with his more combative role in coming days. As we turn to China, we get the same feeling. That China also finished some pending work in the past week. The long drawn agenda about annexing, there is no other word for that, Hong Kong to the mainland was probably completed. It seems that the curtains have now been dropped on many years long democratic peaceful agitation which was wanting China to maintain for the period of the rest of the commitment, the one state, two systems arrangement which it had agreed when the island was transferred to the mainland by Britain. China has introduced a very tight security law, and it seems that the will of the protesters has been broken. Now with the new security law in place, China can give them much harsher punishments, take them if need be to be tried on the mainland, which is what they fear most. There has been a crackdown on the media, there has been a crackdown on almost everything, and I think the way the protesters had held almost to ransom the civic services, and there were a few acts of vandalism which the Chinese government took advantage of, but the fact remains that the whole world was criticizing China for the violation of human rights, for suppression of democratic peaceful movements, interfering with the freedom of expression, but the Chinese made it very clear that they would not brook any criticism in the matter of Hong Kong. Now, the Britain tried to pull the last card, which they thought was a trump. They said that they will offer citizenship, British citizenship, and at least to begin with the asylum, to all the people holding the British overseas citizens' passports. Now, the Chinese countered that very bravely and correctly, and they said, if we don't allow our citizens to get out of Hong Kong, how do you grant them asylum? How do you grant them citizenship? And 3 million people and their family members cannot slowly trickle down and say they are going for education, they are going for tourism. And as the things are tightened, the exit processes, I think this will not happen. The same thing happened. Australia was criticizing China and said that it would offer asylum to safe haven to people who were coming from China and trying to avoid their persecution there. Taiwan said so, and the Chinese threatened them and said that they would be ready to face the consequences if this happens. Ultimately, the Americans, despite all their rhetoric and brave talk, have had to admit that there is very little they can do to stop China from going back on its promises on Hong Kong and imposing a new security law, post Chinese forces there in uniform, and generally do what they wish to do with Hong Kong. Now, the only question which remains to be answered and asked before that is that will this affect the financial position of Hong Kong? Will business be ruined there? Will China ultimately kill the goose that was laying a golden egg for it? Now, I don't think that is going to happen very much. There might be temporary shocks at the moment because the coronavirus had already administered a shock to the financial health of various other countries, including the financial capital of Hong Kong, financial capital of Singapore, and the air travel being interfered, shipping being interfered, the economy is getting into a stalemate in the lockdown period. So I think the Chinese have used this cushion to prepare for the day when Hong Kong is not so indispensable for them. They have a very large market. Hong Kong can still work as a hub for that large market. Chinese have been accused of piracy, intellectual property. They don't need the rest of the world as much as the rest of the world needs them. Now, that is what Americans have had to concede. That is what the European Union has had to concede, whether it is Huawei telecommunications equipment, whether it is pharmaceutical intermediaries, whether it is even cheap ventilators and masks to combat the coronavirus. So the Chinese know that at the moment they have insulated their economy. Their economy is far more self-reliant than anybody else, and beginning from America to India, they have a trade imbalance in their favor with most other countries, and the countries in their immediate vicinity, like the countries in ASEAN, are their largest trading partners, and they are not going to upset the apple cart in a hurry at all. So knowing this, the China can indulge both in an aggressive drive in the South China Sea and towards Indian Ocean, try to use its cat's paw, the North Korea, to behave recklessly like a rogue state and dominate the South Koreans and the Japanese. The Japanese may come out in support of the India in the border dispute with China, but there is very little the Japanese can do at this distance to help India. Now, similarly, the Chinese have devoted time to encircle India in South Asia. The one country which has come out in great support of one China concept is the Pakistan, where the foreign minister said that we stand by China, we believe in one China thing, and he said we include in unification of Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, everything with China. So I think having secured that flank, the Pakistani flank on the Western Indian border, and having pushed there towards Southeast Asia, the Chinese are sitting pretty at the moment strategically and economically, and I think the Hong Kong issue is going to die down a natural death in coming days. There were two developments in Europe last week which may be considered significant, and both of them were expected. President Macron in France got rid of his Prime Minister Edouard Philippe, who had served him very loyally for more than 2 years, and he probably was the most efficient member of his cabinet in the country. There is no other word more respectable to say that he got rid of his Prime Minister, which is not something very new in French politics. The Prime Minister is supposed to be in that country a dispensable commodity, and prime ministerial candidates are made to play a game of musical chairs to suit the convenience of the president, who is the most important political actor there. Now, President Macron, ever since he assumed power, has not actually covered himself with glory. His handling of his commander-in-chief right after he took oath was left a controversial bad taste in the mouth. Then his autocratic ways have not been liked by the French, who are pretty Republican in their temperament. His handling of the Orange Vest was much too authoritarian, and only the last week he was administered a stinging rebuke by the Green Party, the environmentalists, and the left socialist parties. Now, he has tried to position his party as a centrist party, but he has not managed to either get the support of the rightist or the leftist. He is not quite the centrist. People perceive of him as a rich man's president, a pro-capitalist president. Now, Edouard Philippe had to be removed, so the focus shifts back in the next 21-22 months before the elections on President Macron, and he is not there. The replacement of Edouard Philippe is a non-entity, a mayor from a small prefecture, Le Havre, and who has been elevated to the position of the Prime Minister. So not much is expected of him. He's a career civil servant sort of is, and most people believe that Edouard Philippe is also not too unhappy by getting out of this, because he might be the presidential candidate, the rival of Macron down the line when the presidential elections are held. So this is one development. How much it will distract Macron from his participation in the affairs of the European Union, how much attention he will be able to give to Africa, where French legion has been active, is another matter. Would he be in a position to talk about China or Russia in coming days? We shall see. The other development was the failure of the Brexit talks. Now, nobody expected them to succeed. Some people think that some progress has been made in the past, which is enough to carry on beyond the end of the year. But I think Angela Merkel is a great realist who says that, to be truthful, not even minimal progress has been made. Boris Johnson seems to play on this gambler's instinct. He says even no deal Brexit will be a good deal. Now, nobody believes him either in Britain or elsewhere in Europe, but the chances of Britain getting a good deal is very little, and I think the European countries are losing their patience with Britain. Britain allowed tourism to be opened for the British citizen, but kept out of the list Portugal, which depends to a large extent, and Portuguese government has come out with a statement that the rate of coronavirus infection and death is far less in Portugal than it is in Britain. Within Britain, the policies of Johnston have not been very popular. He allowed businesses to open up. Pubs were opened, but the churches were not allowed to open up. Pubs were opened up, but the salons and barber shops were not opened up. The schools, there remains a great confusion. So I think something like Trump, the whimsical flip-flops of Johnston, one-liners trying to reduce everything to a sharp repartee on a television show, is not going to succeed. And also his his other efforts to get rid of a permanent civil servant and replace him with a political confidant has not been found favor with the majority of either the civil servants or the British public. So I think the reduced role of Britain in Europe is going to create a problem, and I think the no deal Brexit seems to stare Europe in the face now. There were some interesting developments on the South Asian subcontinent last week, and some of them a little unexpected. To begin with, there was the problem in Nepal. Problem in Nepal in the sense not a border problem with India, but the untenability of the position of the Nepalese Prime Minister, Mr. Oli. Mr. Oli had leveled a charge that people were conspiring to remove him from his position, and he had pointed a finger without naming India towards India, and this immediately gave rise to a groundswell against him. In the Central Committee of the Communist Party, Prachanda took up issues with him, and 30 members out of 45-member committee were against him. They said that, look, he should either provide proof or resign from the prime ministership. Because at this delicate moment when the country is facing with the coronavirus crisis, he has not been able to cope with the economic problems even before coronavirus. There are charges of corruption, charges of tilting towards China, losing the neutrality which Nepal has traditionally had. So I think they said either you prove your charges or you sort of leave your position as a prime minister. There was an additional argument which was put against him, which was that there should be one man, one post. He can't be the chairman of the party and he can't be the prime minister also. He retired into a huddle, he prorogued the parliament, he met the president, he refused to have a dialogue with his critics and opponents, he locked himself up in his house. Then of course he got himself admitted in a hospital for a routine checkup. So he was indulging in dilatory tactics. In between, something very interesting happened. The Chinese laid claims to villages in the northern periphery of Nepal, and this seems to be the beginning of a border dispute about some construction work which was taking place there. Now it seems that Mr. Oli has overplayed his Chinese card. Chinese know that he can't go back to the Indians seeking help, and the Chinese are now putting pressure on him to extract their pound of flesh. The Chinese ambassador in Kathmandu met the president, which is highly unusual. Normally they meet the prime minister. Normally they meet the foreign minister. After having presented their credential, the ambassador doesn't really meet. But in this case, Nepal apparently is on the verge of a kind of a constitutional crisis which is brewing, and the Chinese ambassadors meeting the president also conveys wrong signals both to the Nepalese population. Now it is nobody's intention that India should interfere with whatever happens in Nepal. What happens in Nepalese politics is entirely the business of the Nepalese people, and also let India not gloat over this, because even if Mr. Oli is replaced, the problem with anybody who succeeds him would be that he or she would have to prove that they are not Indian agents, they are not friends of India, they are primarily Nepalese patriots, and the excessive emphasis on Nepalese nationalism put by Mr. Oli would see to it that for quite some time to come, the relationship between Nepal and India would remain precariously balanced, and where both sides have to be very, very sensitive to the sensibilities of the other side. It has already been said in Nepal that let's not use the rhetoric of roti beti, special ties between Nepal and India. So let's talk as two mature, independent, sovereign nations with, at times, we'll have a clash of national interest which should be reconciled peacefully, including border. And no third party should be allowed to interfere. So this is what about Nepal which we should keep in mind. Another neighbor of India, which shares a border with China, also had problems, unexpected problems with China, and this was Myanmar. What happened in Myanmar was a very tragic incident. There was an accident, there was a mudslide in a jade mine, which was maybe illegal or maybe it was partly legal, where no safety precautions had been taken. A similar accident had taken place a couple of years back. Some close to 170 people died. There might be some more trapped in the mine, and people immediately said that these mines are being worked smuggled illegally, and the jadeite which is mined out of these mines is being smuggled across the border to China, where the jade is valued very greatly, and the Chinese authorities at the border have turned a blind eye towards this smuggling. Now let's not forget that this is the area where the non-Burman insurgents have been active for a long time. The Karen state, the Chins, the Shans, and these insurgencies have been on and on. And the government in Myanmar, the central government, has followed a policy of live and let live with them. Now this time, for the first time, the army, the Myanmarese army, raised the objection that the arms found with these rebels were of Chinese origin. And they did not name China, but they said it seems that an external power is interfering in the stability of our state and national integrity. They did bring up the issue of the Rakhine state and the Rohingyas. And the Rohingyas, so far it had been mentioned, were being armed and trained by the fundamentalist Islamic forces. But this time the army laid the charge that where did the resources to get these arms come to them? So the problem is that we probably have to worry about rising of tensions between Myanmar and China, because the Chinese again probably taking advantage of the, in their mind, favorable circumstances, putting pressure on all their other neighbors and try to extract from them as much favorable bargain as they can. And as an aside, as we close this discussion on the South Asian subcontinent, was the issue of the Baloch terrorist attack on the Karachi Stock Exchange. Now the Pakistanis were quick, without naming India, to point out fingers and say some external power is helping Baloch rebels and so on, while the fact is that ever since its inception, the Pakistani ruling elite, the government and the army, has been a Punjabi Pathan dominated one, where the minorities like Sindhis, the Baluchis, the northwest frontier tribes have been given a short shrift, and air force has been used against Balochis, the armed forces have been used against them, and their respected leaders who had been central ministers like Bugati have been assassinated. So you can't blame for whatever is happening in Balochistan on India. Pakistan has come out staunchly in favor of China and said that Imran Khan has said that he would take all steps to implement the China-Pakistan economic corridor as fast as possible. It's ironical that when he was in opposition, he was criticizing the CPEC as a channel of corruption, as a channel which was going to hurt Pakistan, going to land Pakistan in a debt trap. But right now, all the position has changed. Imran Khan depends on China for its support, and whatever is the resentment against Pakistanis, the Pathans and the Punjabis in Balochistan, which surfaced with the Baloch terror attack on Karachi Stock Exchange in which some lives were lost, Imran Khan realizes that the port of Gwadar is of great strategic and economic significance in China's long-term strategy, and once China puts so much emphasis on the Gwadar port and the CPEC and the One Belt One Road and the revival of the historic Silk Road, Pakistan has little choice. This leaves India in a slightly odd corner, tight spot, because India, under American pressure, American persuasion, has what it has done. It has opted out almost of Iran. And there was at a stage when India was helping Iran rebuild, enlarge the port at Chabahar, which was supposed to be a port in proximity of Gwadar and would counterbalance its strategic and economic significance. But once India stopped buying oil from Iran, once India cut off its ties, more or less followed the voting directives from America against Iran in international fora, I think the possibilities of balancing the Gwadar port with Chabahar have receded into oblivion. So that's one part which we must keep in mind, and this almost encircles India on the western flank. So India would have to remain very, very careful about this. The Chinese can dictate their terms to Imran Khan or any other government in Pakistan about the CPEC, about the Gwadar port, and the Baloch pinpricks are not going to cause great trouble to either China or to Pakistan at the moment. But for India, they might create yet another occasion where Pakistan might like to divert attention from Baloch troubles by doing something on the other front, like in India. Many international relations experts who analyze developments in Iran were very curious about news coming out of Iran, that country, last week. The Iranian leadership came out with a very unusual step. They requested the Interpol to arrest Donald Trump for his complicity in the murder of General Soleimani. This had happened quite a few months back in January, and at that time, Iran's response to this assassination of one of its top military commanders was rather restrained. There was a symbolic protest, there was a symbolic retaliation, but Iran had taken precaution not to cause any civilian deaths or hit any strategically important military target that Americans valued. So why should it now raise this issue after 6 months? It knows fully well that the Interpol does not issue red corner notices on complaints which are politically motivated. Is almost unimaginable that the President of the United States would be served a warrant. But then I think what Iran is doing is following a policy of very interesting diplomatic preventive measures. Americans have been imposing such kind of restrictions on top members of the Iranian ruling elite, their family members, imposing restrictions on their travel abroad and so on. So perhaps this complaint to the Interpol, and even if Interpol dismisses it, would give Iran some basis to retaliate with similar restrictions on American diplomats, American journalists, American business interests in Iran. That is one part. Interesting diplomatic ploy. The other news was yet another explosion in the vicinity of Tehran, and once again the speculation was rife that the explosion took place in a facility which is associated, involved, related to the nuclear program of Iran. Iran has made it very clear that as long as the Americans do not remove the economic sanctions against them, do not go back on the agreement on peaceful uses of nuclear energy, it would continue with its weaponization program. But at the same time, it has assured the rest of the international community, including America, that if the Americans are prepared to reconsider the nuclear deal which Obama had put in place, they would forsake military weapons development program. But what is more interesting is that this kind of transgression of Iranian sovereignty, although the Iranian government has till this date not pointed a finger about this explosion to somebody, but I think part of it is also not to let the morale go down in Iran. If Iran concedes that its sensitive nuclear military installation was targeted by some foreign power and some cohort operation could damage it, it would speak very badly of the security and the capacity of the government to maintain its sovereignty within its domain. But these things have happened in the past. Iranian scientists have been assassinated. Iranian targets involved with nuclear energy development have been devastated. So this time also people suspect that there might be an element of sabotage here. But this probably is not going to break the will of Iran to resist and continue resisting. It doesn't seem likely that the tensions are going to reduce in the northern tip of Africa, especially in the region which is called the Horn of Africa. Last week, there were tensions between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt about the construction of a high Renaissance dam on the River Nile. This time, something unexpected happened. A very popular folk singer, Hundisu, was assassinated in the capital of Addis Ababa, and this triggered off disturbances which almost destabilized the government. Not only was this singer a very popular singer, he was the creator of the soundtrack of the democratic revolution which took place in Ethiopia a couple of years back. The present leader, Ali Ahmed, assumed power with the support of this folk singer, Hundis. Now the trouble is that Hundis belong to a tribe called Oroma, to which Ali Ahmed also belongs. They are a very large segment of Ethiopian population, but their grievance has been that they have always been overlooked in politics and society and in economics. After Ali Ahmed assumed power, there were differences which cropped up between him and his earlier artistic colleague, and I think Hundis was immensely popular with not only Oromos but the younger generation of Ethiopians. He was supposed to be the poet of revolution, the poet of democracy. He was a best-selling singer also, but the point is his songs were songs of protest, and the songs of protest were resurfacing against the dissatisfaction which was spreading about Ali Ahmed's government. Now, some people argue that he was assassinated to divert attention from the failure of the present government in Ethiopia to cope with the different challenges, COVID included, economics included, the High Renaissance Dam included. But when Ali Ahmed addressed his countrymen, he said that probably the countries which were outside Ethiopia, with whom the relationship of the country is tense at the moment, are trying to destabilize. So Ethiopia is not in a position to enforce its rights either on river waters or on economic front. Now, he did not name anybody, but obviously the target were Egypt, which has declared its intentions to dominate this whole region. Till last week, there were hopes expressed that the negotiations between Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan, encouraged and assisted by the United Nations, would lead to a peaceful resolution of the dispute about the dam, but this seems to have been jeopardized at the moment. In recent past, whenever we have discussed environment, we have focused on climate change or its impact on various aspects of life, biodiversity, destruction of biodiversity, extreme weather events, forest fires, droughts, melting of the polar caps, and so on. Also, disease vectors increasing. Our attention has been diverted from other topics related to environment, and perhaps it was good that last week's news took the focus back on certain other aspects. There was a court in Britain which fined Greenpeace £80,000 as punitive action for having sent volunteers to climb an oil rig on the high seas. Now it was supposed to be contempt of court, violating an injunction given by a court. Of course, the Greenpeace has at times adopted manners which almost border on what the French have accused them of piracy on high seas, but they say that they are within their rights and they are doing something with a clean conscience because they are protecting the human rights, the violation of human rights by oil companies, etc., the environmental damage being done by oil companies, etc. And they say that what they do is in public interest, in the interest of humanity in large, to protect the environment. So the court should balance the nature of, they protest as civil disobedience, mostly peaceful. There is no violence involved. But as far as the custodians of international law and municipal law are concerned, major states are concerned, who seem to protect the oil companies, their argument is that even a civil disobedience movement has to abide by the law 100%. If they do something which is prohibited in international law, they should be ready to face a penalty. The court in this time threatened the executive director of Greenpeace in England by saying that they would have been entitled very much within their rights to send him to jail for a period of 2 years. They were taking a lenient view, but this seems to signal to the environmental activists very clearly that the position of the governments is hardening. But there was a silver lining somewhere else. In another court judgment in Britain, a company was again fined and restricted from exporting its hazardous waste material to China. Now this is a very interesting story where a company called BIF was involved in a multi-billion-dollar business, and it says it was paper and recyclable paper waste, and it was sending this to China. So this was not a poor country receiving the hazardous waste from a rich country, but a rising superpower allowing the import of this kind of a waste material to its own country. And it was not objecting to it, it was welcoming to it, because it was being recycled into other produce and re-exported to other countries which were totally unaware where it had come from. Nobody knows how much hazardous substances survived in the recycling process, and what was being sent from Britain to China in a multi-billion-dollar business between private parties and a government or a government-owned companies in China was sanitary towels, where hospital waste, where sealed packs containing human feces. So all these material was being recycled. It was hardly cardboard or paper recyclable material. So this is probably a rising concern post-coronavirus about contamination, contagion, and probably this gives us some hope that other countries might follow suit, and this hazardous waste disposal in this sinister manner will probably stop. That's all we have for you this week. We shall be back again next week with another roundup with more topics, more incisive analysis. Please do get back to us with your feedback so we can keep improving the presentation as per your requirements. We have taken note of some suggestions which have come to us. We shall implement them as soon as possible, providing you some talking points, some main points, some notes, answer frequently asked questions, maybe supplement this through our podcast with maps and illustrations so you find it easy to grasp and analyze. We also try to recapitulate and review something which we have done in recent reviews, so there is a continuity, you get enough background, and if you have missed something in the past, you have a recap in the next one. Till we meet again next week, goodbye and thank you.